I'm going to take you back to a time that we don't tend to think about very much. I'm going to take you back to 1955. How many of you have seen this book before or some version of it? Okay, fascinating, fascinating. If you were just a bit older, you would have grown up with this in your living room. I'm going to take you back to 1955 and the most widely seen photography exhibition of all time. Millions, about 9 million people have seen it. There are about 8 million copies of this book in print. It's never been out of print since 1955. This was arguably the thing that every living room had to have in America between 1960 and 1975 or so. And I want to argue that it's a major prequel to where we go in terms of new media today. Kathleen, any luck? Yeah. Excellent. Great. Wonderful. Thank you. So that's where we're headed today. We're headed into the past in order to get a glimpse, perhaps, of the present and the future. The talk's going to have 3 parts. I'm going to open by talking about my new book, The Democratic Surround. I've been researching the history of new media technology and technoculture for a long time. And this is a book that's a prequel to another book that you may know, From Counterculture to Cyberculture. And I want to talk a little bit about the sort of research project that these books are a part of, and what it is that I'm trying to do in that work. Then I want to take you deep inside a particular piece of the story, this family of man story. I want to take you back to the exhibition. I want to take you into the critiques of the exhibition that were raised. And I want to maybe walk you through some of the ways in which something as simple as a museum design in the Cold War established a politics of attention and a way of thinking about screens that we inhabit today. And that's where I want to end. I want to pull back by asking, what does the story of the politics of attention in 1950s America tell us about our own time? So 3 parts today. Generally, with questions, how do you guys do them? Do you jump in as we go along? Okay. I don't, but thanks. I'm kind of a control freak. No, we're good. Thanks, yeah. No, I think what would be great for me is if you have questions of fact as we go along, please jump right in. I mean, I'm guessing that some of the material will be unfamiliar to you. Just jump right in for that. If you have questions maybe that are more analytical, save those for afterwards. I'm going to talk for about 40, 45 minutes, which we should have lots of time for questions. So let me tell you a little bit about what I think I'm up to as a scholar. Some of you may know that a number of years back, about 2006, I wrote a book tracking the impact of communal and countercultural ideas and ideals on the American computer industry and the ideals of techno-utopianism. So it's a book that features Stuart Brand, Howard Rheingold, some of you know from here, a number of Stanford folks. Terry Winograd makes a quick appearance here. And it's a book that tried to show how cultural forces and technological forces entwined. In the course of doing that book, I had a strange encounter with the 60s. I was raised in the wake of the 1960s, and I had always been told that the 1960s were a revolution, a complete technicolor overturning of this kind of black and white Cold War world. It was very locked down, very conventional, very sort of father knows best. Imagine my surprise when I spend a lot of time talking to Stuart Brand and Todd Gitlin and various 60s people and reading their diaries, and I discover that in fact, they are reading for inspiration work by people from the 40s and the 50s. They're reading Erich Fromm, they're reading Margaret Mead, they're reading Norbert Wiener, the father of cybernetics. And it began to become clear to me that the 1960s might not have been such a revolution after all, but perhaps an extension of something that had been going on in the 40s and 50s. What I started doing was sort of tugging at that thread a little bit in the library, and I ended up going backward and writing a prequel to this book. So the new book starts in the late 1930s, ends in the late 1960s, and it tries to trace the connections between countercultural idealism of the 1960s and the wildly radical and completely forgotten politics and multimedia of World War II America and the early Cold War years. So what I think I'm doing, and where I think I may go next, is actually to the contemporary. What I'm trying to do as a writer and a scholar is to trace a kind of cultural history of the integration of new media into our lives. That's the goal. That's what I'm trying to do. I don't know how this works for you guys, but for me, I'm in the field of communication. And in communication, what mostly gets studied is stuff in line with the product cycle, sort of stuff that takes every 3 to 5 years and looks a little bit forward. I'm interested in the long cycles, 30 years, 50 years. and how it is that our media technologies enter into cultural processes that are going on long before the devices themselves get invented. So that's what I'm trying to do here. I want to take you into a piece of the story. Maybe before I do, I want to say a little bit more about the book. Well, I guess one other thing. I think I want to give you a broader sense of what the book's about before we go to the family of man. If this book tracked the impact of Stuart Brand and Howard Rheingold on how we think about computing, this book tracks the coming together of two communities, American social scientists and Bauhaus artists. How many of you are familiar with the Bauhaus? Okay, great. Morgan, Bauhaus, what was?
I can't define it for you.
Okay.
I'm just familiar with the look.
Good. Okay, great.
It evokes an idea for me.
Yeah, a kind of modern idea, right?
Yeah, it evokes a modern aesthetic for me.
Modern aesthetic, yeah. Good, yep. I can give you examples, Peter?
Is it related to the beatniks at all?
No, that's the fascinating thing. I was always told that the only radicals in the 50s were the beatniks. Not so. What I'm going to argue in here fairly shortly is that there were some very radical folks actually in American social science and in the art world around the Museum of Modern Art, and even involved in Cold War state-sponsored propaganda, and that we've forgotten their radicalism as we've kind of come to the 60s. So the Bauhaus, a group of German artists devoted to changing people through art in the 1920s and 1930s. You'll know Walter Gropius, Herbert Bayer, who went on to found the Aspen Institute. Those folks, I'll show you some pictures in a moment. They get together with American social scientists and they begin to imagine a multimedia world. And the impact of that imagining, which takes place during World War II, is extraordinary. And that's the subject of the book. So let me take you into a piece of it now. I'm going to take you back to the family of man. The family of man, this is a picture of the exhibition as it was installed at the Museum of Modern Art in 1955. It may seem odd now in our own time, where we're surrounded by all kinds of portable screens, to think about how powerful a museum exhibition might have been in its time. Remember that in 1955, there's movie and there's TV, but TV only has 3 or 4 channels. There are no portable computers, there are no iPads, there are no cell phones, there are no other screens. The world we inhabit now with screens all around us and available doesn't exist yet. So for Americans entering this space, having images at every level is an extraordinary thing. And that's the some of them move, some of them hang from monofilament, fishing line, and do sway. Others hold still. Others are mounted on the ceiling. Others are mounted on the floor.
They're stills.
I'm sorry. Yes, they're all still images. Yes, they are all still images. It's the people who move. The people move from image to image. Great. Good question. So the Family of Man was the most widely seen photography exhibition of all time. It opened in the spring of 1955 in New York. 1955, right after the end of the Korean War, really the height of the Cold War in America. 250,000 people came to see the show in its first 2 months. Think about that number, 250,000 people. That's a huge number of people to be tromping through the halls of the Museum of Modern Art. It went on to be copied 6 times. They made 6 traveling copies of it. The museum did, and the United States Information Agency did. And they took those copies around the world. And it didn't stop traveling the world in those copies for 10 years. The United States Information Agency estimates that 7 million people saw the show in those 10 years on every continent. At the same time, there was a catalog from the show produced. The catalog has never been out of print, about 8.5, maybe 9 million copies in print. Now you just pass that around, look at it. Endless numbers of paperbacks of different sizes were produced. I'll just pass on mine. These are wonderful. They're available for 99 cents on eBay. I picked them up in bunches. So if it falls apart in your hands, don't worry. Every American household had to have this in the 50s and 60s. It's an incredible thing. So the show travels very, very widely, goes to 37 countries. It's now actually permanently mounted in a chateau, in a castle in Clairvaux, Luxembourg. It's going to stay there forever and ever, yeah, in its original form. You can see me on a video there talking about it. The important thing that I want you to grasp here is not only that it was everywhere, but that it was very particularly this thing, the show you see with your heart. I'm going to argue that seeing with your heart is a particular form of vision that was developed during the Cold War in this multi-screen environment with the aim of transforming your psyche, of turning it quite literally in a more democratic direction, of making it possible for you to empathize with others who are unlike, different from you. I'm also going to argue, maybe less persuasively, but I'll take a shot, that seeing with your heart is an early precursor of the kind of empathetic vision that some of the folks who manage Facebook would like you to operate with. So that's where we're headed. To understand the Family of Man's place in the history of multimedia, we need to step back and take apart the story that was told about it before. The Family of Man is not only the most widely seen photography exhibition of all time, it's also the most widely excoriated. This show has been loathed by an entire generation of critics. Since the early 70s, the show has been depicted as an emblem of everything that's wrong with Cold War America. Roland Barthes here, who I really enjoy in his kind of classic French intellectual pose, you can almost hear him say, French phrase, freedom phrase, it's like, whatever. All right. So the Family of Man gets knocked really hard, and it gets knocked as an emblem of American imperialism for a couple of reasons. First, it's depicted as having a narrative structure. So it depicts the life of the human being from birth through family, through all kinds of events, 500 images, to death. And it uses images from around the world, 273 photographers from around the world, including the Soviet Union, depicting life at every stage from around the world. And yet, critics have read it as saying that it walks you through from birth to death and tells you a story about what a person should be. And that story is itself oppressive, simply because it is a story. Second, it's been depicted as being oppressive because of its imagery. We're going to look at some of those images shortly. A number of critics have argued that the images are by definition racist. They have argued incorrectly that there are no depictions of African Americans and white folks together. They have argued, again incorrectly, that African Americans are depicted as impoverished throughout the book, while white folks are not. Again, that's incorrect. I've actually been called a racist in a public event for suggesting that that was incorrect. Well, it's wild. People care a great deal about this show. Based on those critiques, folks have argued that the exhibition was a species of kind of visual colonialism, a deploying of visual techniques that would manage faraway peoples and turn them in American directions, and sort of take over the faraway senses on behalf of America. With that part of the critique, I'm actually a little bit sympathetic, but we'll come back to that. That critique rests on an understanding of where the show comes from. When the show was created, it was created by Edward Steichen. Edward Steichen was a very well-known advertising and fashion photographer in the early part of the 20th century. He took beautiful portraits of society ladies and political leaders. If someone were taking pictures of Madonna today, it would be him. Okay? He goes on to become the first curator of photography in the Museum of Modern Art's history. Now, you got to remember that photography in the middle of the 20th century is kind of a dirty art, not in the sense that you think I might mean by dirty. I mean in the sense, just checking, seeing whether you're with me here. I mean in the sense of it's a very low art. It's sort of a magazine art. It's a sort of a street art. It's not seen as high art, and the Museum of Modern Art is devoted to high art. Steichen, nevertheless, finds a way to begin to bring photography to the museum. And when the Family of Man is created, it's depicted as springing, fully formed, from the genius of this character, Edward Steichen. So here's the story as it was told in Life magazine. And Life chronicled the development of the show from the very beginning. Steichen had been making photography shows at the Museum of Modern Art for many years. He'd done 3 propaganda shows, 2 during World War II and 1 during Korea. And he said to the press in 1955 that he'd actually been a pacifist all along. It's not true, but it's interesting. He said, "Although I had presented war in all its grimness, 3 exhibitions, I failed to accomplish my mission. I had not incited people into taking open and united action against war itself. What was wrong? Well, I came to the conclusion that I had been working from a negative approach, that what was needed was a positive statement on what a wonderful thing life was, how marvelous people were, and above all, how alike people were in all parts of the world." Now, to us today, that notion of likeness being the basis of an exhibition sounds incredibly hokey, or at least it can. We're so raised in the wake of discussions of political difference, ethnic difference, individuation, that it's sometimes hard just to hear what it might mean for people to be alike across races, across ethnicities, across nations. To give you a little context for this, I want to only note that Steichen is responding to a critique of difference that has an entirely different ring than we remember. In 1955, he's living with the memory of fascism, and the memory of fascism potentially in the United States. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. In 1938, to my astonishment, the Nazi Primer was published in the United States. The Nazi Primer was the handbook for National Socialist youth. It's like the Boy Scout handbook for Nazi children. The very first line of the Nazi Primer was, the foundation of the National Socialist outlook on life is the perception of the difference of men. Different races, different ethnicities. That was the key to the social organization of the world in the Nazi view. The Aryan race was somehow better than what they called the Dinaric or the Baltic. So when Steichen is calling for a celebration of men being like one another, it's not calling for the erasure of difference. Rather, he's calling for the embrace of similarity in a way that erases Nazi theories of difference. I'm getting a little ahead of my story, but I think you'll see where I'm going in a moment. So Steichen and one of his colleagues got together. He recruited images and image makers from around the world. Many famous Americans included Ansel Adams, folks like that, Diane Arbus, Bill Brandt from England. He also reached out to the photo agencies of our enemies, or at least our erstwhile enemies, like the Soviet Union. He worked out with Sovphoto, which is the Soviet photo group. Found images of people around the world in every life stage, 10 million of them, apparently, according to Life magazine, and winnowed and winnowed and winnowed until he had 10,000 of them. And then he moved into a little apartment in New York, took those 10,000 images, and cut them down to 500, and started making maquettes of the show, started making models of the show. This process of selection was widely covered in the press, and it resulted in a story that resulted in an exhibition, journalists claimed, that was in fact a story told by Edward Steichen about what it meant to be human in the world. And it's that story that's been so rigorously critiqued over the years.
So is the archive of his 10,000 images still available? In other words, did they get still? So
No, they're not still available. No, they're not. He sorted them out, threw them away. There are pictures of him working with them that exist in the Museum of Modern Art Archives. So you can actually see pictures of those, but you never get to see the giant pool from which he chose.
Oh, phooey.
Yeah. My feeling exactly. You may see that later. There's some work right now. Some of the Steichen papers have been unavailable for many years. If they come online, there might be things in there that we don't know about, but nothing that we know about suggests that that full set is there at this point. The point I want to make is that the exhibition did not spring fully formed out of Edward Steichen's head. Rather, it grows out of something very different. It grows out of a World War II push against fascism and mass media, and it does two things. It draws on Bauhaus aesthetics and theories of what was called at the time the democratic personality, and it aims to liberate the senses of viewers, psychologically and politically. This sensual liberation, I think, is a key to how we get to our own time. To understand how that worked, we have to go back to the late 30s. Looking around the room, I don't think any of us were alive in the late 30s. I've spent an awful lot of time in my imagination there, so I'll walk you through. The late 30s was a time during which there was a terrible fear of fascism and a fear of mass media. Imagine that you're an American intellectual in the 19-teens and 20s. During that era, Germany is seen as the epicenter of intellectual activity. It's brought us great musicians, it's brought us great poets, it's brought us great philosophers. In 1909, it even brought us Sigmund Freud. Well, actually, he's from Vienna, but, same difference. Well, it's not the same difference. That's right. Well, it was the same difference by 1939. The point here is that how on earth did a country as cultured as Germany become as enamored of fascism and as enamored of this little mustache dictator as it did? How did that happen? Well, American intellectuals and American journalists centered around an idea and came to believe that, in fact, the answer was in part mass media. Mass media in two senses. One, mass media had a unique power to penetrate the mind, to undermine the reason, to subvert your ability to be critical, and to invoke and stir up your unconscious in such a way that you felt this terrible desire to melt into the arms of a leader. Okay, so that's one piece. In that sense, they feared that mass media were quite literally the channels of fascist madness. So Hermann Goering, you can see him up there. German leaders were frequently depicted by American journalists in this period as insane, and their ability to control the radio in particular, but also the press, was seen as an ability to channel their madness quite literally into our unconsciouses. Now remember that the unconscious has only been in the United States for about 20 years at this point. It's brand new. All right, so that's fear number one. Fear number two is that engaging with mass media quite literally puts people in the fascist position. The fascist position is the position of being in a mass oriented toward and forced to pay attention to a leader from a top-down position. Mass media worked both these ways, and it was terrifying. It was so scary that even Roosevelt was frequently referred to in the press in this period as the fourth fascist, after Hirohito, Hitler, and Mussolini. Why? Because he seemed to be using the radio, his talk shows, to infect Americans with a desire to centralize and massify their government. It astonished me. I was just amazed to go back into the archives and see Roosevelt depicted as a potential fascist. Now, lest you think that Americans had gone off their rockers in this period, one of the things that I think you need to recall that I had known nothing about when I started this research was that fascism was a very real possibility in the United States at this moment. In 1939, 22,000 Americans rallied in Madison Square Garden in support of fascism. Swastikas stood on the main stage of Madison Square Garden. A giant banner on the side said, "Save Christian America from Jewish domination." In October of 1939, after Hitler has gone into Poland, 1,000 Americans marched down East 86th Street in New York, carrying swastikas and American flags, wearing imitation Nazi uniforms, and they are not booed. They are not booed. There are pictures of this in my book. You can see them. People just stand there watching. Many of you will know Humphrey Bogart as an actor. Many of you may not know that Humphrey Bogart starred in a movie that has been widely just sort of forgotten, starred as a fascist agitator in the United States who kills his Polish-American neighbor. It was before World War II, and regrets it intensely. In the late 1930s, American radio featured people like Father Coughlin, an advocate for the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, famous proto-Nazi text. He had 3.5 million listeners every single week. A Gallup poll in 1938 showed that 70% of those listeners agreed with his views. Think about that. 70% of 3.5 million Americans agree with what is essentially a fascist view. You can see here British fascists in the late 1930s. The fear was that somehow mass media could do to us what it had already apparently done to Germany. If the Germans could succumb, so could we. And we already had cracks in the system, cracks in our foundation, as evidenced by things like the mass rally in Manhattan. As we enter World War II, this is a problem for us. The question for American intellectuals, American political leaders, American journalists is essentially this: how are we going to do propaganda on our own people, get them encouraged to fight the war, without turning them, hey Larry, into fascists? How are we going to do that? Now, some American leaders in Roosevelt's circle said, don't worry about it. Goebbels has a good thing going on. We're going to imitate what he does, and we'll deprogram the Americans later. It's a very explicit discussion. It goes just about like that. Larry, come on up. Yeah. Come on up. Be comfortable. Sit. Yeah, right. We're all in the mass position. We just talked about the fascist position. Other scholars, most notably in Manhattan, began to ask a different question. They began to ask, how is it that we can develop a mode of media that is not massifying, that does not turn people into fascists, but rather promotes something that we might think of as a democratic character? Two answers emerged to that question. The first answer emerges among a committee. I'm not usually a big fan of committees, but this is a really good one. The Committee for National Morale. The Committee for National Morale forms in 1940, led by an art historian named Arthur Upham Pope, and it includes people like Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, Kurt Lewin, the leading intellectuals of the day. How many of you have read Margaret Mead, by the way, just out of curiosity? Okay, great, good. Okay, younger folks who may not know Margaret Mead was the leading anthropologist, most famous anthropologist of the 20th century, famous advocate for feminism, went and studied women, young girls in Samoa, and argued that women in America, this is 1940s, 1950s, should have a degree of sexual freedom that was not allowed by and large in American culture. She was a very, very large intellectual in that period. Her sometime partner, also teacher, Ruth Benedict, enormous and very powerful advocate against racism in 1940, 41. If you don't know Mead and Benedict yet, I want to urge you to spend a moment and find out a little bit more about them, particularly if you're a young woman. Very powerful intellectuals. This group also included a lot of psychologists, and the psychologists had the idea that there was a thing called the democratic character. They were operating under the notion that somehow the personalities of the citizenry formed the basis of the society around them. That there was a thing called the democratic personality that could give rise to a democratic society. There might be a thing called the authoritarian personality that would give rise to a fascist society. We obviously needed to encourage democratic character. We needed to find a way to bring our people together that wasn't fascist, and we needed to find a mode of media making that would do it. The Committee for National Morale people began to fantasize multimedia. They said, look, if fascist media is one to many, then we've got to come up with a mode of media that is in fact many to one. We've got to surround people with images and let them choose among those images the ones that are most meaningful to them. Margaret Mead put it this way. She said, she's talking about food. She says, most cultures are restaurant cultures. Most cultures just have one thing they want to eat. America is a diverse culture. It's a cafeteria culture. And we need to develop a cafeteria form of media, a form of media in which we surround people with things they can take on board in their own way. Now, Margaret Mead, the community around her, not really media makers, but fortunately for them, they were surrounded by Bauhaus refugees. Artists who had come over to the United States from Germany, usually about 37, 38, and they brought with them a really powerful understanding of what multimedia could be and how it would work. They had been building multimedia environments in Germany in order to, they believed, help German citizens under the chaos of Weimar Germany become new men, resist the pressures of industrial society on their psyches, and instead turn into something a little bit more integrated, more whole. When they got to New York in the late 30s, they were unemployed, they needed work, and they were more than happy to repurpose this aesthetic to help make democratic new people. So Herbert Bayer was the leader in this movement. Herbert Bayer is a pretty fascinating guy. He developed the lowercase typeface that many of you see and use on your computers and in other settings. He was a Gestaltist, not a Freudian, and he was the first to design this kind of environment. And this is from 1935. It was actually developed first in 1930 for a series of exhibitions in Europe. And you can see there that he imagines a person, literally as an eye, able to take in images from around the entire body. Not a biological possibility, but a very interesting theory. This may just look like a funky diagram to us, but in 1935, this is a revolution. At that moment, most media shows, most photography shows certainly, some exceptions, and I can talk about them later, are arranged with like this, with like a painting on the wall, like image, see it, move to the next. Image, see it, move to the next. Boom. Very linear, very eye level. The idea of surrounding people with things is totally wild. Bayer, in fact, worked to hang chairs off the wall in a show about the living room at one point. He believed in surrounding people with images. Very radical idea. In 1942, that idea became the basis of an exhibition that Bayer did with Edward Steichen called Road to Victory. Road to Victory was Steichen's first propaganda show during World War II. And as you can see, it's quite literally a road. Here's the entryway. Some very hokey, very stereotyped images of Native Americans. Some text by Carl Sandburg, who was Edward Steichen's brother-in-law. Carl Sandburg was a poet. You may remember him. If you don't remember him, he was a very middle-brow, middle-of-the-road kind of poet. I believe he was the one who talked about Chicago as a big-shouldered city. Okay, yeah. He has a little text there. What was interesting about this show was that it gathered images from all over the press and arranged them in such a way that people would move among them and encounter them, some big, some small, clearly for a propagandistic purpose. Here's Hirohito laughing about Pearl Harbor, for example. Over here he says, war, they asked for it, and by God, they'll get it. So it's propagandistic, but in a new way. It's propagandistic in a way that asks the viewer to move among the images. Again, to us, this is old hat, but in 1942, it's a big deal. The press comments on it. The press says this. The press says, this is Edward Alden Jewell, the New York Times, no one can see this exhibition without feeling that he is a part of the power of America. It is this inescapable sense of identity, the individual spectator identifying himself with the whole, that makes the event so moving. And here's my favorite. This is Elizabeth McCausland of the Springfield Sunday Union and Republican. She says, Road to Victory does not mold the visitor's opinions, for that word smacks of the fascist concept of dominating men's minds. The key point here is that to Americans in 1942, Road to Victory looks like an anti-fascist, pro-democratic way of arranging images. If you surround a person with images, if you surround them with ideas, they will move freely, independently, among the images that you have selected for them, and they will come to a truth that is simultaneously their own and yours. Again, I'm getting a little ahead of the story, but folks who spend a lot of time online should begin to see the politics of curation bubbling up through this. The politics of selecting the arrays from which and within which we live our lives, starting to bubble up right here. All right, I'd like to jump ahead now 10 years. I'd like to jump to The Family of Man and to 1955. Anchored as it was in the 1942 show, The Family of Man brought with it not simply a narrative spun out of the head of Edward Steichen, but a whole series of understandings of the world. Some things had changed in America in the intervening years. Fascism was the enemy during World War II. It had faded away and been replaced by communism. Terrible fear of the mass man, the fascist, the Nazi during World War II, that was replaced after the war by the fear of what Adorno famously called the authoritarian personality. Now, scholars of sociology will remember the authoritarian personality as a very important construct in this period. What we've tended to forget was that there was an equally important construct alive at that time, the democratic personality. The democratic personality is what comes alive in the middle part of the century as a form of American character. To give you a sense of what the democratic personality is, it's interesting. According to Adorno, the potentially fascistic individual is one whose personality structure is such as to render him susceptible to anti-democratic propaganda. The American democratic personality is different. In 1942, Gordon Allport says, he talks about democratic morale, and he talks about how every personality can be a citadel of resistance to tyranny. Now, in the Cold War, the same idea comes back. This time, the individual personality is going to be a citadel of resistance to communism. To make that come into being, Steichen turns back again to Herbert Bayer's system of design. The Family of Man has often been read as a series of images arrayed in a sequence through which visitors are marched. I'm going to show you that that's not the case at all. Rather, it's a surround. It's what I call in the book a democratic surround, an array of images designed to help produce democratic sensations in the individual person. But even at the level of individual images, it's an extraordinarily powerful and dangerous enterprise. I'm not sure how well you can see this, and I'll show it to you later, I think, in a better image, but I do want to give you a heads up. 1955, 10 years after the end of World War II, a traditional Japanese farm family is depicted over American heads. Now, again, we've all grown up in the wake of World War II. But imagine that you're an American who's had a husband, a daughter, a son killed by the Japanese. And now you're being asked to identify with, look up to, physically look up to traditional Japanese. My grandmother was so upset by the war that when I bought a Toyota in 1984, she almost stopped talking to me. Seriously, you can't imagine. My other grandmother lost her brother in the war. She couldn't even talk about the war. Imagine asking people to do that. And the Japanese are not the only ones on the wall here. We also have Italians, formerly fascist Italians. And not only that, we have Africans, polygamous Africans. Africans, at a time when, we're only about 3 months before Rosa Parks sits down on the bus. America is racially tense. We've had race riots throughout World War II and into the early 50s. And now Americans are being asked to identify with an African family and many African American images. And they're also, white Americans in particular, are being explicitly compared to these groups and shown as equal. Here, though it's hard to see, is a depiction of an American white family from Appalachia around a wood stove. Nor was the show a narrative in the traditional sense. This is a diagram of the exhibition from Reader's Digest at the time. You would enter the show here, and you would enter a birthing area. You would literally see pictures of birthing and birth. You'd leave that area, and you were then pretty free. Okay, so there are a number of themes here. I'll just read a few to give you a feel for it. Childbirth, fathers and sons, folk singing, ring around the rosy, playing, drinking, dancing, music, human relations, death, loneliness. That's the sad part. What else? We got dreamers, hard times, man's inhumanity to man. This is a ring around the rosy for kids. This is that central area that I just showed you. The only ways that you're required to move here, you're required first to enter the birth area, and you're required to leave here through a series of images of warfare, including about here, a giant wall-sized image of an atomic bomb. Steichen hoped that by showing you the likeness, your likeness to the peoples of the world around you, you might overcome your prejudice in such a way as to prevent atomic warfare. But the key point that I want to make is that this is not a space through which you're forced to move in a linear fashion. On the contrary, you're able to roam, to move. But even as you do, you're roaming within a world whose terms have been set for you by others. The images in the world were quite literally meant to be mirrors. Steichen actually hung a mirror in the show for about 2 weeks until he decided that it was hokey. Then he pulled it out. These are images that I took from the United States Information Agency archives of the show overseas in Munich, Paris, and Berlin in 1955 and 56. When the show traveled, United States Information Agency officials studied audience responses to see if it was having a democratizing effect on the audiences. They're very serious about it. You wonder where our department comes from? There's a little bit of this, yeah. No. So I'm in the Stanford Communication Department. Some of our department was in fact founded right at about this moment around questions that this process animates. What's fascinating to me is I've looked at all of the USIA images of the show that I know that exist in the archives, and there are dozens like this. The photographers go looking for these moments when something in the audience resembles something in the image, because this is a moment when suddenly peace seems to become possible. So these are kind of funny ones, right? So these are older Russian ladies and German ladies. Now remember that the Germans and the Russians have just fought a war, so the idea of laughing together is a little difficult. This is a French girl, and those are Germans over there saying, yep, we still have fun. Those are all kind of reasonably benign. But the process wasn't benign at all. Can you imagine what it means to go to the defeated German nation in 1955, or 56 actually, and ask Germans who 10 years earlier have been told that they are the master race, that the Aryans dominate the universe, that they should rule the world, and who went to war on that account, to ask those people to see in Africans people who were equal to themselves? It's an extraordinary thing. The German press was full of it. German press ran endless numbers of stories. I've read, I think, all of them. I hope all of them. And the dominant headline was, Menschen wie du und ich, people like you and me. The kind of difference on which Nazi philosophy depended was quite literally erased through the experience of this show.
Can you comment on the fallout of the show in Germany? In other words, apparently this would have caused ripples.
It did cause ripples, but remember, the flip side of this is Germany's defeated. the Cold War is kicking up. The last thing that German journalists, politicians want to do is anger the Americans. So what you get, the only places you see protest are in small comments in like guest books. And you can see that, but that's all I can see at the time. Yeah?
Was this in East or West Germany?
The two were, so this is in Bonn and Berlin. Berlin at that time is right between the two, and the wall isn't up yet. So there's still, it's still Germany.
Is there a difference between, it was still like?
So it's still nominally Germany. It's been divided. It's subdivided, but Larry, when do they become two nations? Are they two nations at that point?
Nations. The wall in Berlin might have not been up then.
But there's two separate nations at that point. Okay.
Immediately after World War II.
Okay.
So this was, the answer is it was in West Germany.
Yes, that's right. The answer is it was in West Germany, though the wall was not up yet, and I know that people did come from the East for this. And one of the things the USIA figures were tracking was the impact of this in East Germany.
Yeah, so my question is, was there a difference between like the reception in West versus East Germany?
So I don't know of any difference in the documents that I've seen, but undoubtedly there would have been. I know that there was some nervousness on the East side about letting people see it at all, but they thought they couldn't really control that. But again, I'm hearing all that filter through the USIA documents, so the American government reports on how people interacted, so it's a little hard to tell. Yeah.
Did this presentation actually create the reason why it was time to build a wall?
No, not at all. No, that's much later. That's 61 is when the wall goes up, so we're 5 years out. The other thing that I want to show too is here's an American. This is Washington. This is the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington. And here's a predominantly white audience, again, being asked to identify with and appear under a traditional Japanese family, an impoverished white family, an African family. That's a big deal in America in 1955. It really is. It's extraordinarily powerful. We tend to forget it now, but to be asked as white Americans to identify with people of different colors and former enemies in that way is an incredible thing. So for that reason, I see the show as exceptionally liberating. And when we think about the history of multimedia, I think we need to think back to this post-World War II moment where we pushed back on mass media as if it were the tool of fascism. And we hear that now in contemporary debates about hierarchy and bureaucracy and the need to level organizations. What we're hearing there is the echo of debates that took place in the 40s about whether or not we needed to level the media experience, surround people with images, give users more independence as they interact with one another, and found a new kind of democratic order on that process. But, and this is kind of a big but, what we're also seeing here is the emergence of a new mode of managerial mediation, managerial power. This kind of media display, surrounding people with images, surrounding people with sounds, is not hierarchically top-down fascistic. They are not being told what to believe. At the same time, they are being offered a carefully curated selection of choices from which to put their beliefs together. This is a kind of soft power. It's the power of the person who designs the supermarket. It's the power of the person who lays out the shelves in the supermarket and says, you can have any kind of cereal you want, as long as you have cereal. You can have any kind of world you want, as long as it's a world that includes these issues. Now, I am delighted to think of a world that is more diverse, more egalitarian, more tolerant than the fascist world would have been. But I remain deeply, deeply concerned about this mode of curation as the mode of power we inhabit today. And I want to ruminate for a minute on this. So this is the CES, the Consumer Electronics Show in 2010 in Las Vegas. This is actually a design that copies a 1970 art exhibition called the Pepsi Pavilion. I've written about it elsewhere. That exhibition, in turn, is using a series of military vacuum technologies to construct a mylar dome in which the people on the bottom are reflected upside down in 3 dimensions over their heads. So it looks like you're actually looking at 3-dimensional people overhead. It's a visual illusion. This surround is everywhere in our lives, not just in buildings like this, but quite literally. When I look around the room today, I see people on computers, I see people on phones, I've got laptops. In many ways, the vision of empowered individuals moving flexibly through their lives in relation to screens of their choosing as they move, that is the liberal dream from the post-war era. that is the alternative to fascist top-down mass media. But it's also, as I think we can see here, an invitation to enter a world in which you don't just see with your heart others others who are different. You don't see across those boundaries. Rather, you engage with images, interactions, sounds, whose terms have been set for you by faraway others. And because those others are far away, you can't fight with them. These guys can't fight with the person who designed this exhibition any more than the visitors to the family of man could tackle Edward Steichen and say, hey, I want to see a kind of picture that isn't here. So I would argue that this is the beginning of our own moment, a moment in which we are extraordinarily free and yet simultaneously extraordinarily carefully fenced in. That's where I'll stop and take questions. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. Michael.
So this is a question not maybe specifically about the family of man, but maybe more broadly about this politics of attention and
Great.
these new multimedia environments that we're supposed to encourage the democratic personality. So I'm a little more familiar with a period that would have been 20 or 30 years earlier than this, around closer to the turn of the 20th century. At that time, people are very concerned, intellectuals especially, are very concerned with overstimulation. The problem that people in moving to cities, for example, in these environments where they're surrounded by department store windows and thousands and hundreds of thousands of strangers that they don't usually see, and just all these lights and movement and imagery and the new media like movies that are beginning, that you just can't handle it. I mean, they wouldn't maybe necessarily have used the terminology of your brain gets overloaded, but that's kind of the idea. So I'm curious if these Bauhaus people who come up with this surround multi-image environment are aware of that? Are they responding to that?
Yeah, they are.
Specifically reject that possibility of overstimulation, or has that just kind of been forgotten and now we moved on to it?
So they absolutely, it's a great question. They're completely terrified by that, but they frame it differently. They don't see it as overstimulation. They see it as psychological fracturing. From their perspective, it isn't so much that the problem isn't so much that people are surrounded by sounds and images that are new to them and bombarding them all the time. It's what happens when that bombarding hits you. You come with a sort of psyche that's equipped for an agrarian world, and you hit that multiplex and it beats you up. So what they saw themselves doing was essentially creating sensorial training spaces. Best way to think of the Herbert Bayer image is a sort of visual gymnasium, where you can practice the skills on which your survival in that diverse multisensorial world will depend. That practicing in the multisensorial world of the early 20th century becomes the practicing of democratic sensibility later. Great question. Good. Other questions? Yeah, go for it.
One much smaller question.
Best kind.
All the images in the show were in black and white, correct?
Except for one. That's a great question. It's a super important one because the only one that wasn't was a full color, wall-sized transparency, the first ever created by Kodak, of an atomic bomb, the Operation Mike. And it's a huge mushroom cloud. And what's most intriguing about that is that the mushroom cloud was not reproduced in the catalog of the show. And it's unclear, the records don't tell us whether that was because they didn't want it in or because they couldn't reproduce the transparency. There was a picture in some editions of the catalog taken of people looking at the transparency, and that was black and white. So I can't find, I've looked and looked and looked. I haven't found any images of the color transparency, but that one image was in color. Great. Good. Yeah, go for it.
Do you think, are there any remaining remnants of the fascist mode of propaganda in our world, or has the democratic methods sort of?
No, that's great. And so I teach science technology studies a lot, and in my work there, one of my sort of guiding principles is that new regimes of attention and technology never entirely replace the preceding ones. Rather, they tend to layer up on top. So you can see this just in cars, right? Your car still has a trunk and it still has like a dashboard. The dashboard is something that was really important in sort of the wagon era. You don't have to have a dashboard now. There's no special reason you need one. There's actually a name for that thing. It's called a skeuomorph, but that aside. We absolutely live in a time in which folks are trying to take centralized advantage of the media in a traditionally fascist manner. The thing that can't happen now, though, or that's much harder to happen, at least in the U.S., is that you can't control a single channel and make everybody watch that single channel in the same way. So for our era, I actually think the important question is how do the modes of attention associated with the democratic surround interact with the modes of attention and power of centralized media systems, because they both still exist. NBC is still out there. When the president has a press conference, everybody still watches. When we go to war, that footage dominates the airwaves. And scholars of new media know that a lot of what goes on in the blogosphere is an echo of images, stories planted by centralized media forces. So it's exactly that interaction that I think we need to be asking. There's a second piece of your question that's hiding in there that I think is super important, which is, I was raised, I came of intellectual age at a time when the internet was coming online and it looked like it might liberate everything. And we're past that now. It's not going to liberate everything. And it isn't even really, to study the internet alone isn't even really the right question anymore. It's how do you study the internet in interaction with other systems? Buildings, televisions, cars. Media are becoming integrated into the world around us in the most phenomenal way. This media wall is just the first of many you'll encounter. If you go to a football game, you'll see it up there. My point is that knowing this kind of world is especially important if we're going to understand how it is that mainstream mass media top-down systems and embedded media systems are working together.
Fred,
Yeah, Larry.
I thought about his question. I think the last country in the world that mimics this kind of completely domineering single channel, fascistic, total command of the universe of communication is North Korea. There's just
Yes, great example.
There's nothing else out there. Even Cuba now, China long since, Vietnam, all the other totalitarian regimes.
Yeah, the one and only is probably Korea. Yeah, that's North Korea. Mass games terrify me. Great. Yeah, Vivek.
So there is this transition that you make between the idea of the notion of surround, which is being surrounded by different types of ideas.
Yep. Or different types of images, not necessarily ideas, but different images.
To basically a physical kind of being surrounded by devices or objects of sort. So would you think that Mead and others talked about being surrounded by different kinds of ideas, or is it just being physically surrounded by different objects, media objects?
So so that's a really important question. For Mead, the hope was to surround you with different kinds of people, different kinds of communities to which you could become empathetically attached, even though they were different than you. So it's the different communities of difference around you that are important. For them, the media are a platform through which to do that. For the Bauhaus folks, they actually imagine different objects. And those two communities really come together in the story and sort of empower one another. But at the same time, I mean, Mead said something in the book which I love. She said something, it's in the book, but she says, were the world we dream of realized, we who have dreamed it could not live in it. She and her colleagues grew up in a vastly different world than they hoped for, but this is partly what they were hoping to create. Great, yeah, and then Morgan, go for it.
So in this exhibition, you seem to suggest that it's a new mode of mediated power. That's a step of improvement from mass media, where it's just one authority blasting information, bombarding you with information in a one-way channel.
Well, an improvement in this historical moment, not in the long haul, but
okay.
yeah.
Right. And I was trying to, I guess, extend it to the future.
Okay.
What would a future mode of creation be? If this is if presently we have something that's curated by, let's say, one person or one authority, would the future be collective curation?
Right.
And how do you envision that to be any better than the present?
It's such a wonderful question because it points to one of the key features of this space. Analysts who study this kind of thing study what's on the walls and don't think about all this stuff behind the walls. And the stuff behind the walls is what's doing the curation. And the key word here, I think, is institutions. The family of man works because it's at the Museum of Modern Art. It's an institutionalized surround. The connection that I want to make to the contemporary world is that your laptops, your screens, are also themselves portals to an institutional engagement. They are, when you're using your Apple iPad, you are engaging in a series of commercial operations, a series of commercial relations. You can't help it. If you sign in, if you use iTunes, you agree to things and then do things in ways that are shaped for you by those commercial actors. But you have very little way of talking to the commercial actors. Just as these guys have very little way of pushing through the wall and talking to the Museum of Modern Art. So if we're going to change this, if we're going to take the surround form and make it a more benevolent form, then the terms on which we're going to do that are not going to be terms about media. They're going to be terms about institutions. Can we build new collectives to do that work with? I think we live at a time when there's a fantasy afoot. It's a really pernicious fantasy. I call it the expressivist fantasy. The expressivist fantasy says, if I just speak up, if I just make my voice heard online, the world will change. That's hooey. That's just nonsense. One of the legacies of this era, I would argue for our own, is that they believed, as many of us still do, that the impact of media on psychology was such that that's where politics took place. So if we just change the medium, we just change the message, if we do like McLuhan says, we just surround ourselves with new media, the world itself will change. That's where we end up in the 1960s. It's actually where my book ends. You have all these hippies dancing, tripping, lights, sound everywhere. Wow, man, it's a new world! Except it's not. It's not. So I think the proper site for change is precisely around these walls. And that's where forming new collectivities gets critical. Morgan, you had a question, and then Pete.
So also kind of my question, I think, builds on this in a way
Yeah.
because it brings this to a contemporary moment, as you kind of alluded to at the beginning.
Yep.
You mentioned Facebook. So what seems important here is that you're talking about a different mode of media experience that brings us to a conclusion. It's not a story. We're not told we have to get there in a certain way. Like pick your path, like the books. But at some point you get to the conclusion. And the conclusion here is anti-atomic war. But I'm wondering if, as you suggested at the beginning, if we analogize this curated democratic surround experience to Facebook, which also surrounds us with images, or you can pick whatever online.
I just want to connect.
You want, yeah, exactly.
Right.
I'm wondering if you think it brings us to a conclusion in the same way that this experience brings the individual, the self, to a conclusion. And if it doesn't bring us to a resolution or a conclusion, then does that have any implication for the way that the self is disciplined and produced in this new space as compared to the family of man?
Yep. So I want to change one term.
Okay.
I want to change the term conclusion. Because I don't actually think this brings you to a conclusion in the sense of a belief, but rather brings you to a worldview. It brings you to a worldview. In that worldview, you are a freely moving, on your own feet, kind of independent person, moving among others, surrounded by literally a universe of other people who may be quite different than you, but with whom you can identify in this mirroring way. In that sense, it offers you a never-ending introduction to a mode of engagement that's very liberal, very atomized, very individualized, and also to some degree oriented around consumption. When Steichen hoped it would be a mirroring moment. I would argue, if you go back and look, there's a mode of kind of consumption. By consuming the mirror image, I can reflect on who I am. That's Facebook all over. By consuming the mirror image on the screen of my friends or of myself, I can know who I am. So the piece I want to get to here is that what I think they have in common is that Facebook is almost like a geographically unbounded version of the family of man. It seems endless. There are a million friends to have and then millions more. You can like a million things. It never stops. It's like an overgrown supermarket. It never stops. It's like Walmart. You never get to the end, but you're still in Walmart. And because you can't see the walls doesn't mean there aren't walls there. So I think that this introduces a way of moving through the world that's proto-consumerist and will be deployed later in 1959 in Moscow in a very consumerist way, that really sets the stage for the full-on consumerist, bounded world of Facebook. The conclusion isn't, in this case, the medium is the message. How you move through the world is the conclusion. Peter?
I'm going to step past Facebook to the Second Life Jaron Lanier. Now, obviously, Jaron has become somewhat critical of the transformation he initiated.
Yep.
But recently I was in White Plaza tooting on my horn, and
Yep.
I ran across some virtual reality photographers from a Palo Alto startup who are dead set on bringing full immersion to the masses.
Yep.
So tomorrow's Facebook is fully immersive. It has the freedom of walking around in it. It's Second Life-like. I think all the analogies that you've drawn still apply, but all of a sudden the immersion is so deep that the way we as humans perceiving the world take it in may change.
It might change, and I have an ongoing debate with my colleague Jeremy Bailenson about this. And so Jeremy Bailenson, my colleague, runs the Virtual Human Interaction Lab here at Stanford, incredibly interesting place, where he's trying to understand the social psychology of immersive virtual worlds. It's very powerful. And Jeremy would argue, I think, that, that with the quantum increase in computing power, the realism of the experience is such that you are qualitatively different in your engagement with it.
I agree.
I disagree with him. And I think that's an ahistorical view. And let me give you an example. I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you go into a VR room, or like, okay, I'll take Second Life because I know that well. When I first went into Second Life, got my avatar and flew, I literally felt myself lifting up out of the chair. Unbelievable experience. The most strange and wonderful thing. I'm in my chair, but I'm flying. I did it about 5 times, lost that sensation. Just kind of like, oh yeah, I'm in Second Life. I'll go over there and talk to him. Okay? There's a way in which, through repeated use, things lose that. Likewise, I want to say that for this audience at this moment in 1955, a world where there's cinema and television and radio, but not much else, these kinds of images are extraordinarily potent. They feel real in a way that we have trouble appreciating because we are so bombarded with images. And that's why, if we go back further in the talk, that's why something like simply redesigning the hanging of images in a museum is such a revelation to people in the 1930s, because they're living in a much more media-impoverished world. My point, I guess, is that we adjust to the media around us as we go, and that we've had a kind of very high level of engagement and realism in lots of media before. We've forgotten it, though, as we've begun to increase in the avatar space. So I don't think the avatar space will be that different in that dimension.
I think there's a neurological threshold, though, where you stop getting the cues that tell you you're in the virtual world.
Right, right.
And apparently there weren't enough cues that you really were flying for you to just...
That's a fair point. That's a fair point, yes. And if you put a helmet on someone and control their space completely, yeah, the neurological cues do disappear. Yep, go for it.
Just curious, was the innovation of the billboard a product of, like, in the middle of this era, or before this era, or after?
Oh, the billboard comes into its own in the early 20th century. It's before this, and starts in the late 19th.
That just seems like such an idea of reimagining the hanging of advertisements along a thoroughfare.
Right.
It's almost kind of Bauhausian.
It is. It is, absolutely. And in fact, people used to make fun of these, I think it was Brill Cream. I don't know, Larry, you and I may be the only people old enough to remember this. Or Burma Shave, that's it, Burma Shave, the Burma Shave road signs. So Burma Shave was a company that made shaving cream and shaving gear, and they would have signs all the way down a highway. So, it'd be like a story, and you'd follow it down the hihighway. I don't know, is Wall Drugs still do this? Anybody here ever seen the Wall Drugs bumper sticker? Okay, so it's in the Dakotas. If you're driving across the country, it says, I've been to Wall Drugs. And when you get to Wall Drugs, actually in the Dakotas, you have to stop. And it's just this crummy little drugstore. But you've been hearing about it for 7 states. Yeah, good. Other questions? Go for it, Shinjong. Oh, Shinjong, sorry, I saw Shinjong right in front of you. Kyoko, we're going to just keep doing this. I don't know. My bad. Go for it.
I was wondering if, you mentioned Adorno.
Yeah.
For them, the pleasure you feel in a space like this can be an factor that makes you apolitical, right? It's just like makes you depoliticized rather than make you democratic. And then in terms of time and everything, I was wondering if they, this kind of argument.
Yep. So the Frankfurt School is all through the story. In fact, I have most of a chapter on the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School folks are actually very good friends with the folks on the Committee for National Morale. And part of what's driving the Committee for National Morale's embrace of multi-screen media is Adorno's critique in particular of mass media. And remember that Adorno's critique in New York in 1941, 42, 40, that sort of right start of the war phase, he's a living example of how wrong that can go. So he's taken very, very seriously. I've never found anything that Adorno says about this space, the democratic space. He's always focused on the negative. He focuses on the authoritarian personality. But some of his sources, especially Erich Fromm, were very active in theorizing the democratic personality and in theorizing the value of this kind of space. Kurt Lewin did a famous series of studies on democratic modes of interaction versus authoritarian modes of interaction. Kurt Lewin was part of the Committee for National Morale, thinking very much along those lines. But the Frankfurt School folks are socially connected to this world, and their critique of mass media is driving a lot of this. Yeah. That's another thing we don't remember. Like, I never knew that the Frankfurt School folks and the good liberal American media critics in this period were like one. They agreed. A couple of exceptions, but not many. Great. Good. Other questions?
So one last one here.
Go for it. Yeah, please.
So if, let's say, Mead and the other intellectuals were alive today and
Yep.
want to, let's say, reshape the media environment around here,
Yeah.
will they be talking about changing the nature of curation? So the kind of bubbles that Google and other services bring to us, particularly, let's say, Google News kind of an environment? Or will they be talking about changing the physical environment of our interaction with media?
Neither, I think. I think they would go a different way. I think that Mead and her community had a faith in the state that has disappeared from our discourse entirely. And I think that what Mead would say is, how can we use the American state to change the physical circumstances, break open the bubbles that are being formed, and make sure that people speak across differences? I think if Mead were alive today, she would look at the Occupy movement and be mortified. Would just be mortified, and she'd look at the Tea Party and be even more so. I think that she would not want to see calls for the diverse America that the Occupy movement is making happening out on the street. She'd like to see those happening in the halls of the government, where the Tea Party has been kicking our butts lately. I think that's what she would like to see. So I think that to the extent that she would want to change the two things you make, she would bring in a third actor who we've just almost stopped thinking about, the state. Great. Thank you very much for coming with me into the past. I appreciate it.